Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today's session, as you can see, is going to focus on occupational heat stress with two speakers and two projects aligned with the Heat Shield project, Horizon 2020 project, focusing on looking at the negative impact that workplace heat stress can have on health and productivity. We've had a number of speakers on this session, so this is the third season. All the previous talks are available. You can see a number of different talkers, a number of different topics from the season 1 and season 2. And then a fortnight ago, we kicked off season 3 with a topic focused on space and microgravity and the consequences of that. As I briefly mentioned on the previous slide, all these talks are openly available and free to watch it at your leisure on the Environmental Ergonomics YouTube page. So if there's any that you haven't seen that you'd like to catch up on, please do so. And with particular focus on this session with occupational, to say we've covered a range of topics: heat, cold, environmental, hypoxic, to name just 3. We've also got some other occupational sessions in this portfolio. So if you're particularly interested in occupational physiology, we've got a couple on firefighters and a couple related to the negative effects of wearing PPE during a global pandemic. Today we have 2 speakers, as I say, linked into the Heat Shield project. We're going to start with Dr. Josh Foster, who's currently based out in Texas, but you'll hear from his accent that is not where he is originally from. He's moved to sunnier climes from my part of the world. Josh is going to be talking about how we can use data looking at work capacity and temperatures and changes in both to see whether we can model and predict changes in productivity, performance, and the like in a warming world. After Josh, we're going to have Jacob, and Jacob is going to talk on a slightly more narrower focused project where he's going to look also under the Heat Shield umbrella, but looking at environmental stress and motor cognitive performance. As with previous sessions, if you've joined us before, or for your information, if you haven't, each speaker will deliver their talk initially, and then we'll open the floor to question and answers. Please feel free to use the Q&A section if you have any questions to pose during the talk. Then we'll move on, do exactly the same for the second talk, and then if there is still interest or time at the end, we'll wrap up with a couple of questions that might apply to both speakers. Well, once again, thank you for joining. I will stop sharing and then I will pass the floor over to our first speaker, who will be Dr. Josh Foster.
Great, thanks. Let me just try and share my screen. Try and get this to full screen. Here we go. Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be able to present some of this work as part of the ICEE series. So thanks to Chris, Stephen, and Tadek for the opportunity for that. And it's particularly nice being able to present the work now. Most of the studies over the last that we focused on data collection for the last sort of 4 years really at Loughborough University have mostly been published bar one now. So it's nice to now take a more kind of helicopter view of some of that work. So for anyone who doesn't know me, my name's Josh, and I'm currently based in Dallas, Texas, as part of the Institute for Exercise and Environmental Medicine at UT Southwestern Medical Center and Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital in Dallas. The work, as Chris mentioned, was funded by the European Commission under the project name Heat Shield. So just a bit of context is probably required as to what the real large scale problem was and how we were trying to address that, and also why to try and bring forth the argument of why the EU have put so much funding and focus into trying to address this question. So one of the things we know, and this isn't only with climate change, but this is already this is already a daily concern in many climates regionally, is that we know that heat stress incurs quite a large amount of economic damage. And again, that's whether we look at present climates in certain regions or whether we look at future climates with climate change. And that has a substantial impact on the global economy. So it's something that we need to understand first. And then once we understand it, we can try and hopefully impact that in a positive way. So the first example I have was from a recent paper published by Garcia Leon in Nature Communications. And it was looking at the effects of the regional effects of summer heat across Europe and the corresponding losses in regional GDP. And so we can see that the negative effects of heat on GDP are very latitude dependent. As we get closer to the equator, we start to see some very large independent effects of heat stress on GDP. And moving to the United States, if we look at future climate change, again, we see very large regional impacts of heat on county level GDP. And again, within the United States, as we move more towards the south, we start to see really quite large potential impacts of heat on the global economy, on regional economies. And in this particular scenario, again, we're looking at we're comparing present day data and end of century data, assuming no cuts in CO2 emissions. So that's what you see there with RCP 8.5, so a kind of business as usual scenario. So now the thing with these estimations of GDP loss is that they incorporate a lot of different factors. They incorporate things like heat stress-induced losses in agricultural yields, increases in violent crime with heat and global warming, coastal damage from coastal storms, and of course labor loss, so heat-induced productivity losses as well. And that's not to mention, as we well know, the health impacts of heat as well. But focusing on the heat stress-induced productivity losses, what we've measured, at least what we've seen actually observed, and not just focusing on future climates, is that in 2004, heat-related productivity loss specifically cost Germany over 1 billion euros. And in 2014, Zander and Tord Kellström showed that heat-related productivity loss in Australian workers for that year cost the economy over 5 billion euros. So clearly a very real and very significant issue that we need to try and understand and help alleviate. But one of the really important things about this is that accurate costing and accurate forecasting of the effect of heat on the global economy requires an accurate model to be able to predict that properly. I mean, that makes sense. So just for anyone who's not familiar with what I mean by that kind of phraseology, in this context, when I talk about models, I'm talking about a mathematical equation which links the heat, the thermal environment, to any kind of loss of productivity or work capacity or something like that. So the models that have been used, and particularly in the model that was used in the example for North America, have some quite serious validity issues. In some cases, they were the best that were available at the time, but nonetheless, they could be substantially improved upon. So some of the validity issues that they have are that they may have just been not based on empirical data whatsoever and entirely on theoretical data. They may have been based on one metric alone. So we know, most of us here who work in thermal physiology, we know that air temperature alone is actually quite a poor predictor of human performance in the heat. We know that, for instance, humidity and wind speed and clothing and things like that all independently have quite strong impacts on the ability to perform physical work. So surely we should be accounting for things like that. And in some cases where those things are accounted for a little bit better, they may have been undertaken in quite a narrow span of environments with fairly few subjects. So of course, that then prompted us as part of this kind of big picture project in question prompted us to actually generate a new model which was applicable on a global scale. So for a model to be applicable on a global scale, it should be generalizable across different industries. It should be based on empirical data alone. So that's data that's collected in the lab or observed in the field, and not heavily extrapolated or interpolated for that matter. It should be relevant across a wide range of heat stress levels, from relatively mild, so the lowest levels of heat stress that we might see in the natural climate, to the most extreme heat levels of heat stress that we might see even with worst case scenario climate change. And finally, it should be usable if you're wishing to use the model with any kind of heat stress metric that's available. So there's lots of different heat stress metrics that different climate models will use to predict future climate. Some climate models will use air temperature and humidity as an input. Some will use a more integrated metric like wet bulb globe temperature or UTCI, which accounts for a lot of these factors and provides one value. So any model which actually is in which you can use with any of these heat stress indices would be, of course, beneficial. And those are currently not available until we publish this work. So a bit of a background into the method and how we actually approach this problem. Well, one of the first issues, and this was not trivial, and we piloted work for quite a while trying to solve this problem of how do we simulate self-paced physical work in the heat. We can't use the classical exercise physiology approaches such as time trials or time to exhaustion tests, because we're just straying too far away now from what the type of work behaviors that would be observed in the field, especially with self-paced physical work. But then we stumbled across this idea in that what we observe in the field, and this has been actually observed across a number of different industries, is that regardless of the heat stress intensity, what you see is a fairly constant heart rate profile. And that's really interesting because it shows that workers are actually, they're willing to work, at least in physically demanding jobs, a kind of upper acceptable working heart rate. And I can show you that quite clearly in this nice paper by Kalkowski and Kampman in 2006, and this was in the mining industry. What we see on the x-axis here is basic effective temperature, and I don't want to get into too much detail about how that's calculated. Just think of it as it's another integrated heat stress assessment metric. So as we go from the left of the x-axis to the right, we're just increasing the heat stress intensity. So we're going from mild to more extreme. And on the y-axis, going from 0 to 140 is the median heart rate measured throughout the day. So that's incorporating work and rest. And of course, with this, what we can see is that there is absolutely no pattern observed between heart rate and the level of heat stress. It's completely constant throughout these different heat stress intensities. And consequently, what we see is that the rectal temperatures, so the metric of I guess safety and risk of hypothermia, follows the same pattern. So the median rectal temperature throughout the day is not responsive to the level of heat. And the conclusion of that paper was that the reason for this is that miners reduce their energy expenditure with increasing climatic stress, so increasing heat stress, to keep their sensation of strain at an appropriate level. Now, if you're a health and safety guy, that's fantastic. That's the answer to kind of, at least in self-paced work, you know, mitigating any kind of risk of heat stroke or hypothermia. But it's a really big problem, because with increasing levels of climatic heat, in order to keep those heart rates stable, the energy expenditure, the productivity has to come down, and that's the entire basis of the self-paced work simulation that we ended up using. And just finally, it's not only this study which has shown this. Again, this has been shown many times across a number of different industries. So again, as the heat stress goes up, work rate comes down. And then it prompted us to use a fixed heart rate protocol to actually replicate the self-paced working behaviors in the heat. And we were not the first to use this. This was actually first used as a proof of concept by Ollie J's group in 2019, looking at the impact of fans and air conditioning to look at productivity losses. So just now zooming in on that protocol in a little bit more detail, what did we actually do? Well, we had to be pragmatic. We couldn't do all of our experiments using like a full day kind of work shift, although we did do a lot of experiments with that time frame towards the end to validate this with these 1 hour predictions. We used 1 hour of walking at a fixed heart rate of 130 beats per minute. And the treadmill that we used was fantastic at achieving that. You just program it into the treadmill where a heart rate strap, and then it will adjust the speed and grade to ensure that the heart rate is actually at 130 beats per minute. We used young, healthy adult males, and we completed these experiments first in a reference condition, in a cool condition of 15 degrees Celsius, all the way up to 50 degrees Celsius, and with relative humidities of 20% up to 80%. So we're accounting for these two primary factors which can impact working capacity and performance. And we did this in two clothing conditions, semi-nude, and which was just effectively shorts and trainers, and with more realistic work coveralls as well. The work took place in one of two environmental chambers. This was the larger chamber and the one we used for at least 90% of the trials. Nonetheless, both chambers were excellent and able to achieve the given task. We can see we used the Cosmos treadmill inside a custom-made wind tunnel, so we can precisely regulate all of the factors which could impact work capacity and heat loss. So just a kind of final schematic of what this protocol looked like again. So this is just an example of what may happen in the reference trial, so with no heat stress. Again, this was at 15 degrees Celsius. We can see that on the x-axis we have time, on the right to y-axis we have heart rate, and that's just what's represented in the red, so 130 beats per minute. And then we have speed or grade on the left y-axis. So in a typical cool trial, speed was capped at 6 kilometers per hour because we didn't want to transition into any kind of jogging or running, again, because it's just too far away from what we see in occupational heat stress. And then depending on the fitness level of the participant, there'll be a given grade of the treadmill in order to achieve that heart rate. So just a theoretical example, let's say that there was 2,200 kilojoules of work achieved in that trial, and you could express this as calories or as well, you know, we just chose kilojoules. So you actually get a performance metric out of using this protocol, which is the really nice thing about it. Now, if we, for the same subject, if we were to now transition into a more hotter trial, we can see that towards the end of the trial, the speed starts to decrease. Heart rate is exactly the same, again, because we're fixing the heart rate 130 beats per minute. But we can see what's really mediating the performance, the changes in performance is this change in grade. So the grade profile is substantially different between the two trials. And again, the actual patterns of this, of course, depends on the heat stress and the individual fitness of the person. But as we can see, the speed doesn't actually drop down until the grade reaches 0. So hypothetically, if 1,500 kilojoules of work was achieved in the hot trial, then we would calculate work capacity as 68%. So 1,500 is 68% of 2,200. And that's really the approach we used time and time again to work out the effect of these different parameters on heat stress and on productivity loss, excuse me. So the main projects that we looked at over the course of 3 years, I mean, we conducted a lot of experiments, myself and James Smallcombe mostly. We conducted a lot of experiments trying to answer a lot of different questions. And the first was just to produce a global model to improve upon the predictions of regional productivity loss and consequent economic damage, especially with climate change. The second part was where we introduced high wind into the equation using the wind tunnel to precisely regulate that. And we also looked at solar radiation using solar radiation lamps, and Jacob's talking about more of that later, specifically looking at cognitive function. And then the only study which is not yet published, so I'm not going to be talking about that specifically today, is that we actually validated these 1 hour based projections with full day protocols, and James Smallcombe's leading that, and we're hoping to submit that fairly soon. So the way the modeling works is that you have physical work capacity on the y-axis. So that clearly ranges from 0 to 100%. We can't exceed that range. And then we have some marker of the heat stress intensity on the x-axis. And again, I'm not going to get too, you could talk for a whole seminar on heat stress indices, but effectively wet bulb globe temperature is one of the most commonly used in occupational physiology and occupational hygiene. And for now, just think of this as an increasing heat stress intensity from the reference condition up to the most extreme conditions. So first, we have our reference condition, which we always mark at 100%. And then all of the trials which we then do in different heat stress conditions will then be a percentage of what was achieved in the reference condition. So as we move through increasing heat stress intensities, we see this pattern emerging, and where we can actually then form a model based off this data and predict over the course of, in this case, wet bulb globe temperature, what work capacity actually is. So we collect this data, and then in reality, this data would be the average of several different subjects. And then we draw a line through it. And then there's an equation associated with this line. So in this particular case, and the one we used for the paper was a sigmoidal type expression. And what's great about this is that it covers the entire range of possible heat stress scenarios from low to high. And we can effectively input any level of heat stress and then get a value of physical work capacity fed back to us. So that's excellent if you, I guess, trying to use this as part of a climate change assessment of productivity loss. So I hope that's clear. I mean, feel free to ask me, of course, any questions towards the end. It's very difficult to really go into too much detail on this and then talk about the results in the space of 20 minutes. So just going to try and go through some of the results. This shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. I realize I'm quite close to the 20 minutes already. So what's different about our model compared with other models? Well, our model's on the red line. This is again expressed relative to WBGT. Compared with other models in general, our new expression, again, all based on empirical data, is more sensitive, especially to mild levels of heat, and we actually predict greater physical work capacity at the more extreme levels of heat compared to the other two most commonly used models. We can see the model by Dunn, which is not supported by any empirical data. This is a hypothetical model based off ISO International Standard work rest ratios. And we also see an improvement from the Kellstrom model, which is based on some of the work by Cyril Windman in South African gold mines, especially in terms of its sensitivity to mild levels of heat. The model's available, again, based off a number of different heat stress assessment metrics, including WBGT, UTCI, humidex and heat index. So for instance, humidex and heat index are the most commonly used heat stress assessment metrics by the weather stations in Canada and the US respectively. And we also generate a model based off air temperature and humidity alone. And that was really important because a lot of climate change models actually use air temperature and humidity as an input. And we can see a representative matrix of that here. So with relative humidity on the y-axis and air temperature on the x-axis. So again, we're really able to cover the whole spectrum of possible future climates. One of the intended uses of the model is to then incorporate it into climate projections. And this is effectively the whole point of why we were trying to do why we were trying to do this in the first place. And that's the real value of generating models like this. This particular graph, I mean, it's way preliminary, so it's going to take some work to adjust the finer points of it. But this is an actual integration of our equation in a climate change assessment model. And as we can see in mid-July, the closer that you get to the equator, we see some quite substantial losses in physical work capacity in the peak temperatures of the day. So again, that's a little bit preliminary, it's pre-publication, but that's the intended use of the model at least. I really wanted to go into a lot of detail on these other studies, and I just didn't have time to really do them justice. So effectively, we use the same protocol to answer a number of different kind of big picture questions. The first, so I guess part 2 as part of the series, was to look at the impact of electric fans on physical work capacity and heat. So just using an example from the low clothing coverage condition, we can see each panel represents a different air temperature. So we used 5 degrees Celsius air temperature increments. And on the y-axis, what we can see is the relative humidity. And on the x-axis, we can see the impact of fans, of increasing the airflow, increasing the wind speed, on physical work capacity. So if we just focus on the way left graph, the 35 degrees Celsius air temperature condition, we can see such a strong relative dependence on humidity on the impact of fans at the high levels of humidity. So at 80%, fans have an extremely strong positive impact on work capacity, and at the lower levels of humidity, that impact is negated. And we can see that we have these for the different air temperatures as well. We incorporated that with a biophysical model to then, again, really try and just answer the question, give something practical and usable to occupational health and public health agencies towards, for any given environment, what is the impact of fans. So in the green boxes, we'd recommend using fans. In the orange boxes, the fans are safe, but generally not that effective. And in the red zones, fans are ineffective and actually potentially harmful. In part 3, we looked at the impact of solar radiation using solar radiation lamps. And again, Jacob's going to be talking a lot more about some of the impacts of cognitive functions specifically. But we were primarily interested in the effect of work capacity. So again, using solar simulation lamps to replicate the impact of added solar radiation, we were able, across different humidity levels and different clothing levels, to really give a kind of big picture answer as to, depending on the environment, what is the actual impact of solar radiation on physical work capacity. And effectively, don't have too much time to go into the finer details and nuances of that, but it's very strongly dependent on the given environment and the clothing level, of course, as well. So we've been lucky enough to publish these as a series in the International Journal of Biometeorology. Our first one, I guess our primary paper, is the advanced empirical model to estimate the impacts of climate change and heat on human work capacity. In part 2, we were able to look at the impact of air velocity on some of these parameters. And in part 3, we were able to look at the impact of solar radiation. Part 4 is upcoming, and that's looking at the impact of work duration. And again, that's led by Dr. James Smallcombe. And as a final paper, this was more of a retrospective analysis, so it wasn't really part of the series, but we were able to tease out the impacts of aerobic fitness on some of these work capacity functions as a consequence of heat, and actually adjusted the equation so with VO2 max as an input value for that. So finally, we'd just like to acknowledge, especially my colleagues at the my past colleagues at the Environmental Ergonomics Research Center, especially George Haveniff, James Smallcombe, and Simon Hodder, for helping me out tremendously with this project and providing some of the initial ideas. My collaborators on the paper, who again were just completely instrumental in allowing us to have some quite useful papers, hopefully useful and highly cited papers, and of course all the members of the Heat Shield project. The participants, of course, were absolutely incredible. There was a very heavy testing schedule and quite a high commitment from the participants in some cases, over the course of a few years. So we're extremely grateful to those guys. I'd like to thank my current colleagues at UT Southwestern Medical Center, especially Professor Craig Crandall, for allowing me the time to actually present some of this work today. And of course, the vICEE committee for organising these seminars and keeping us all educated during COVID. So thanks very much. That's me.
Great, thanks Josh. Thanks for that nice overview. If anyone does have any questions, as I said, please do use the Q&A function. Whilst you do so, I was wondering of the sort of you talked about the generalizability, if that is a word, of the prediction of the model. Did you factor in sort of natural heat adaptation or anything like that? Because I noticed that obviously the hottest areas have the predicted greatest reductions.
Yeah.
But presumably many of your participants weren't perhaps as heat adapted as those people would be. I wonder if you could sort of comment on that.
Absolutely, and it's a really important point. We specifically tried to minimize heat adaptation. It wasn't always completely possible with the heavy testing schedule, but I think we did a fairly good job of minimizing that by only allowing participants to complete 1 or 2 trials within this given week. Would heavily heat acclimatized individuals show a different response curve? Likely. One of the ways in which we accounted for that, or at least we tried to account for that, is in the fitness adjustment. So what we'd expect based on past modeling data is that an individual at the upper end of the fitness spectrum would likely follow a similar curve to someone who's highly heat acclimatized. What we don't know is what would happen if you have somebody who's simultaneously highly fit and also heat acclimatized. I'd expect that their response functions would indeed be different, and it's actually the same thing with with females, with older participants. These are studies that need to be done to see how these response functions change for sure.
Cool, thank you. And another one, which again is just linked to the generalizability. I don't envy you trying to come up with a prediction for everything. But you alluded obviously to some of the considerations and concerns with sort of like WBGT, where it's fine, but at the extreme, it tends to sort of not necessarily reflect the stress provided. Did you look into that at all into the model, or is it trying to, for simplistic purposes, just looking at it on its own?
So I'm not sure I fully understand the question. So WBGT.
So, like for example, if it's not particularly good in extremely humid environments, or as predicting the stress, or it's not particularly good when there's quite a large convective cooling element. So I don't know, higher winds and things like that. Like I wonder if that was factored in.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, one of the things we showed in the high wind paper is that the WBGT is indeed not very good at predicting work capacity, just based off the differences in wet bulb temperature. Yeah, I mean, that was really one of the main motivations for trying to, I guess, provide these response functions for almost every type of heat stress index available. The most accurate model, I guess, was the air temperature and humidity model. But in terms of heat stress assessment metrics, it was actually the heat stress index, which is used in the US, which provided us with the highest accuracy. One of the problems with WBGT is that there's this break point where you see this. It's not very sensitive in differentiating between hot, dry, and hot, humid conditions. So one of the things I can actually just very quickly show is this. Oh, hopefully I can. Here we go. So if we focus on the WBGT, we can see there's this breakpoint around kind of 32 degrees Celsius WBGT in panel A. where we see it's quite a substantial amount of error, and especially if you look at the individual data, then that's really quite high. And that's not necessarily an issue with the protocol, it's an issue with the WBGT not being quite as sensitive as it needs to be in differentiating the level of heat stress in subtly different scenarios. So if we compare that with panel E, the heat stress index, we see that it actually separates these two, this hot, dry and warm, humid condition better, and it provides us with a better R squared. So
great. So I think one of the recommendations might be to change how people assess it in the workplace then. Yeah. Okay. One quick question from Stephen, and then we'll move on to Jacob.
Josh, I was just asking or wondering about the kind of extrapolating kind of the data and possibly beyond its abilities, but what about kind of work over the course of a full 8-hour day, kind of how much it might degrade from the start to the finish? And then related to that, what about kind of multiple days of exposure, and not necessarily counting heat adaptation, but I know Zach Schlater has shown that there is increased kind of increased heat strain on the second day of a firefighting task, even after they seem to come back kind of all healthy and recovered. So can you talk about how you feel this model kind of might need to be adjusted for those conditions of a long exposure or kind of multiple days of exposure?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's another really important point, and that's what motivated us to do a lot of full-day trials towards the end. Effectively, one of the main conclusions of that work, in which we do provide correction factors for work duration, is that there is an interaction with the heat stress. So at fairly modest levels of heat, really the 1 hour predictions are really quite good. There's a really minimal amount of error between the 1 hour predictions and the full day. As we get to much more extreme levels of heat, then they start to deviate more towards full day versus 1 hour, with errors of around between 15 and 20%. But we're going to publish that work, and we're publishing correction equations for that. The second part on different heat exposures over consecutive days, I would expect that would have an impact on productivity. One of the things perhaps I should have differentiated at the beginning of the talk is that one of the variables we're really focused on is work capacity. So the difference between capacity and productivity is, I think in our context, is that we're really looking at a best case scenario. So what is the maximum amount that could possibly be achieved for the average worker throughout the day? Now, if we were to change that to productivity, if we were to just literally change this y-axis to productivity, that would probably overestimate what would actually happen. Again, and one of the issues with that would be that people would degrade that performance over the course of a week or several days. So really what we're looking at is the maximum possible work output from a group of workers. But again, it's just yet another study, which is it's another question which is just dying to be asked in this context of work capacity and heat.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Josh. A really interesting body of work there, trying to sort of loads of data, really interesting stuff, and really applicable immediately, and then obviously looking for the refinements later would be even better. Right, Jacob, if you would like to share your screen, please.
I will indeed. Just a minute. Full screen. If it works, come on.
He's thinking about it. Oh, we've got your speaker view.
You got my speaker view?
Yeah, we can see your next slide.
Okay. That's not that good. How do you change that? Is that better?
Yeah, perfect. Floor's yours.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. Today I want to talk a little about environmental heat stress and motor cognitive performance. So it's a continuum what Josh just talked about, but we zoom in on this, what we define as motor or fine motor control and more cognitively dominated performance. And I did this with the Heat Shield project. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Feder Piil, and I'm a PhD at the University of Copenhagen, and right now a postdoc fellow at the same department in motor control and neuroscience. Interesting, it doesn't work. Now it works. Okay, so what we know and what Josh just talked about was that we know that environmental heat, it affects workers. And what you see here on the screen is a picture I borrowed from a paper from Leonidas, one of my colleagues in the heat shield project. And what we know is that it degrades workers' health, it increases worksite accidents, and it definitely low productivity, and therefore it has a detrimental effect on income also for the workers, but also for the big companies. What is less clear is how it affects cognitive performance. Many of the studies which have been done is a single one study where we see slight decrease, unchanged performance, or even faster reaction time in tasks such as choice reaction. And therefore there seems to be quite a large discrepancy between real occupational scenarios and laboratory testings. It's not because, it's not, the study was not conducted just to explain the whole situation, but more so to try to elaborate on how cognitive or the deterioration in cognition might affect some of the things we see in the real world. But as there was no such protocol that was sensitive, or we didn't thought it was sensitive enough, we wanted to develop our own, and we did so. So we developed this, what you see in the picture, where you sit in front of a computer screen. All this, what I did was laboratory based, I need to say. So you sit in front of a screen, and you have the ability to pinch with your fingers on a small strain gauge within the first task, what we call the complex motor task. You need to pinch and control the green cursor within each 5 boxes displayed on the screen, and this alternates between trials. Then on the top we have like a more cognitively dominated task, or we at least call so. It's a task where you need to use the numpad, and you get 4 numbers each in one corner between 1 and 20, and then you need to calculate as fast as you can and type in the result. On the bottom in the middle you see it's a combined task. It's a combined task between the first and the second I just talked about. So you need to pinch the number you calculate and then hold it steady for the remaining time of the tests. All tests took 12 seconds with the second in between where the results of the given test was displayed in the bottom right corner. And then on the last test, we had a simple motor where you simply needed to pinch the number displayed in the center of the screen and hold that for the 12th second, or as long as you could. Why we wanted to do this is because most of the previous cognitive task or motor-based tasks are single off, and most work, field work, does not rely on a single component, but rather you might pick a grape and you lose a grape and you pick it up from the ground, and you need to talk to your colleague about how much did you pick, and you need to walk. And also, so we try to make it like a combination of multiple tasks. So this may be more effectively showing deterioration in motor and cognitive performance. Before starting all that, we went through a lot of pilot testing. I would say close to 6-7 months of just pilot testing to find out a battery and just programmed battery so it worked. And furthermore, we familiarized all subjects prior to starting any of the trials with 500 trials, so 2 hours of simply just tracking the complex motor task. And what you see here is from trial 1 to 50, it's pretty difficult to hit the target, and after 450 trials, you're pretty damn good at it, and has a substantial score. And what is more important is that you can actually reproduce this score day in and day out. So that was a big focus for us, and this may explain some of the variance between other studies that has been conducted prior to this. And here's just a calculation that you can see scores on the left y-axis in percentage in that particular trials over time. You can see it stabilizes, and then the coefficient of variance that decreases over time. For my PhD, I had like 4 prime objectives. We wanted to, first of all, have a sensitive protocol that was sensitive to show hypothermia-induced deterioration in motor cognitive performance. We also wanted to show if dehydration had a separate or a combined effect together with hypothermia. Then the whole solar radiation, Josh just mentioned that I would talk about. If the sun has a selective effect on the brain temperature and motor cognitive performance, this was like drawn out of something that Lars Nybo's supervisor back in the days, Bodil Nielsen, did, and further Lars developed some trying to cool the brain, and then I thought to myself that we could maybe heat the brain selectively, and then lastly we wanted to see if heat acclimation had a protective effect against these deteriorations. All the 4 papers I'm going through is published, and this one is published in Temperature. And for the first study, we hypothesized that hypothermia would deteriorate performance in the complex task, and the performance would be more vulnerable to hypothermia when completed in a multi-part protocol compared to separate tested. And I will explain that now. So we divided the protocol into what we previously had shown people do, like with the separate task, which you see here on the left side in the gray box. So that alone. And we did a multi-part where it alternates between all the different tasks shown by the arrows in a semi-randomized order. For this paper, we had 10 subjects through, and they went through 4 trials. They did the control trial in 20 degrees on the separate and the multi-part protocol, and then they went in a heat, completely randomized across all trials. And in both trials, in the control, they heated up 1 degree after 1 hour of exercising on a bike at 100 watts, and happened to be 2 degrees in the heat protocol. And to the results, what we saw here was that the most pronounced effect we saw, and a significant effect, was on the complex motor tasks, both when completed as a separate trial, but also as a multi-part trial. And what we thought to ourselves here, even though they're not statistically significant, there's a substantial larger decrease in the complex in the multi-part protocol, and we also saw a little decrease in the simple pinch task, as explained by the gray bar on the right. And what we see on the x-axis is the control and the heat, baseline and hypothermia, and then we see the performance in percentage on both the y-axis. So after doing this, we were pretty confident that that this is a sensitive battery of tasks, especially the multi-part, and we went on with that. So that's what we used for the remaining studies. Next up, we wanted to look at dehydration. It has been like a pretty big topic in both the news media and stuff like that. That this should be avoided, and people should remember to drink. So we hypothesized that dehydration or 2% body mass loss would aggravate the impact of heat stress on motor cognitive performance, and that the complex task, both the combined motor cognitive task and the complex task in itself, would be more susceptible to dehydration and hypothermia compared to the more simpler tasks. And this was published in 2018 in PLOS ONE. And what did we see? Yeah, first of all, we wanted to see if it has its place in the literature. Like, is hyperhydration or dehydration common in the public? And therefore we took the 5 industries concentration in the concentrated in the heat shield: agriculture, police, tourism, construction, and manufacturing. And and we measured their USG at either the onset or end at the working day. And we had, this is, I believe it's 140 participants across Europe in all the 5 different industries. And what was quite shocking, even though it's a crude measure, this USG, we saw that 70% of all workers tested in these different industries had an USG that is above or above 1.02, which is categorized as dehydrated or hypohydrated. So therefore we thought to ourselves, no, this is pretty interesting, and we moved on and had 8 participants in this particular study. Two where we dehydrated participants 2% and one where they stay aerohydrated. Prior to this protocol, we estimated based on pilot testing with the subjects how much they will need to drink, and we weighed them regularly during the experiment, and they were tested in the motor cognitive test protocol at rest, at moderate heat, and after severe hypothermia. And moderate heat is 1 degree above resting levels, and heat is 2 degrees or more above resting levels. And what did we see? We saw similar pictures for the complex motor task and the simple motor task, as we saw in the first experiment, with a larger deterioration when dehydration was superimposed to the hypothermic trial, and we did not see that much when dehydration was as a standalone. What was even more interesting was that the cognitive dominated task, it's a math task, and it's most of our participants were actually able to close to having no mistakes, as you can see here in over here after dehydration with moderate increase in hypothermia. But when they become severely hypothermic, we saw a 5% decrease in the performance, and when we recalculated that to numbers of errors, they actually double the number of errors. So if they normally do, I think the normal was around 2 errors in this task that lasted 30 minutes, and they double or even more. So some of the participants, as you see here, do really well. They are not able to calculate. I think one here are not able to calculate at all. And the same for the combined motor cognitive task in the bottom. We saw a similar picture, and that was pretty interesting to us, and said to us that at least in very hypothermic conditions, you should definitely avoid dehydration. But within all this, and as Josh mentioned, it's regularly reported that we don't see any core temperature above 38.5 in the real world occupation, whereas in most laboratory settings you need to have quite a high amount of hypothermia before we see anything. And therefore we thought to ourselves that solar radiation, which is non-existent, you can see it above my head here, but it's non-existent in the literature of cognitive performance. Bodil did something back in the Bodil Nielsen did something back in the days where she had an umbrella, and with and without an umbrella, and saw that increased heart rate when solar radiation was applied. And then Otani followed up with some other exercise studies, and therefore we wanted to see how solar radiation, if it has a direct effect, and we therefore hypothesized solar radiation directly applied to the head would increase brain temperature more than when applied to the lower body. And we also hypothesized that solar radiation applied directly to the head would affect motor cognitive performance to a large degree compared to lower body radiation at the same heat load. But before moving into all this, measuring of brain temperature is fairly complicated. Lars has done some of it prior to this with the AV difference over the brain with jugular vein catheters. We didn't do that. Instead Bodil had also done something with the brainstem evoked potential back in the days, and latency changes between the peak 5 and peak 1 after hypothermia. And what you see here on the x-axis is brainstem evoked potential latency, and we can discover like 5 peaks. And on the x-axis we see in milliseconds, and on the y-axis we see it in millivolt. And what we observed here is that the red is the normal trial without heat, and then when we heat participant up, we see a latency decrease displayed with the black line below, and therefore we thought to ourselves that this is at least an indicator of deep brainstem temperature, and we might be able to see changes when we applied solar radiation directly to the head. And therefore we did another line of trials where we verified this, and what we saw was that with each 0.5 degrees increase in core temp, we saw a change in the interval between peak 5 and peak 1, and that was fairly linear. So we set it up with a heat radiation trial. So I created some lamps that display the infrared and the visible lights. So it's halogen bulbs that produce in the center of the sphere on the head, produce or measured at 1000 watts. So it's superimposed, and the same at the lower body, as displayed in this schematic drawing. And we tested people at baseline without any radiation, both trials, and we test them out at acute exposure. It's 15 minutes, and then after prolonged exposure, how much they could endure, and it was fairly similar. They could endure approximately 1 hour of sedentary under the sun, and we had 8 participants for this particular study. So the first result was the BAP following the lower body and heat, and what you see here is that radiation or the BAPs. This is for on the left we have one representative subject for these measures, and what you can see for both trials, that you see a decrease in the latency, or a change in latency between peak 5 and 1. And the same, and we displayed it here as also on the right, where we see delta change in core temp on the x-axis and changes in milliseconds between peak 1 and peak 5, and there was no differences between the verification trial, the low body heat or the low body radiation trial, and the head radiation trial. So there was no changes in, or it was similar changes to regular heat in these evoked potentials, and therefore this could not explain if there was anything. But what we observed, and what was really interesting and had me speculating afterwards, if we should have, you can also in retrospective be intelligent, but this could be more cortical driven, and therefore because what we observed was that that when solar radiation was applied to the head, we saw a massive decrease in motor cognitive performance, and the core temperature was only increased 1 degree, which is similar to what we see in the field, and therefore, and this was only for the complex motor test. No change was observed in any of the other trials, so it's consistent with our first study, but at half the increase in core temperature, and that was really interesting. And maybe if we had another measurement, a P50 or something like latency peak, we might have seen, which is more cortical driven, we might have been able to see a change in cortical temperature, and this could drive it, maybe. And lastly, we had a heat acclimation. We hypothesized that heat acclimation wouldn't protect hypothermia-induced performance decrements in fully heat acclimated participant when core temperature was fixed or clamped. This was published in 2019 in Environmental Journal of or International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. We did 28 days of heat acclimation, so a really long protocol compared to what previously was done. 13 participants cycled 5 days on and 2 days off at 60% of VO2 max, and were tested at day 0, day 14, and day 28. They were their own controls because of the longevity of the study. And just to assure that everybody was heat acclimated, we looked at exercise time and thermal discomfort, and you see exercise time on the x-axis and on the top graph on the A, and thermal discomfort. And what you see is that it takes longer after day 28 and day 14 to reach your max thermal discomfort. And thermal discomfort on the b-axis on the B graph on the y-axis, and core temperature followed a similar pattern throughout the protocol. We also had other measures. I didn't bring them today. But what we observed for the motor cognitive performance, again for the complex motor test trial, we saw a similar decrease across days when reaching your max core temp. Therefore, we did not observe any protective effect. And what was even more interesting was that vulnerable subjects kept being vulnerable, and pretty heat redundant subjects were kept being non-affected by the heat, and that I think was the most interesting to drag out of this. And just to sum up, so if we take all the studies in combination, we see that the complex motor task, as hypothesized in the beginning, is the most vulnerable to all of the different interventions. When you then apply or superimpose dehydration, you see a decrease in all of the trials, and similar with solar radiation. And the most interesting was that solar radiation, the observation there was at way lower core temperatures than what we had else seen. Yeah, thank you for the attention. And lastly, I wanted to thank Professor Lars Nybo and Professor Jesper Lundby Jensen and Dr. Nath Morris for all the collaboration. Big part of in this study, and I couldn't have done it with, of course, all the participants and all the other co-workers I've had on these projects. So thank you all, and thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you very much, Jacob. A very nice overview again of a number of studies in an area that I've looked at a little bit, and I know it's pretty complex. It's all difficult to kind of come up with any general conclusions from the literature because they are all so varied.
Yes.
I was wondering, based on that, because I've been looking to design some similar studies myself, I was wondering whether you could maybe comment on perhaps the impact that activity itself might have on the cognitive performance, because you were using active heating methods, weren't you, rather than passive hypothermia?
In some of them, yeah, but in solar radiation it's passive, whereas in the others. But if you look at the first study, I'll just scroll back. So I actually think that just by getting active, you actually will promote some of the cognitive functions, so faster nerve conductancy and stuff like that. And that's also what's evident here in if you look at, can you see the mouse on the screen? Yeah, maybe on the control, but under normal condition, where they actually heat up 1 degree, and you see a similar score. And therefore, I don't think that exercise per se plays a role, but it is difficult to say based on my studies that exercise, I think it will promote most of the cognitive function stuff. So you will respond faster. You will be like when you warm up for a soccer game or equivalent, then you get better. Except if it's in extreme hot conditions, then you maybe should minimize. So, but it's difficult to say from my studies, I believe.
Okay, thank you. And with the, again, a sort of slightly more method-based one, but with the heat acclimation study, was I right in taking from that you got the decrement within session, but heat acclimation itself wasn't particularly beneficial to protecting the impairment? That's right. Yeah.
So if you, heat acclimation is definitely beneficial because it's prolonged the time before you observe the decrement. But when you reach your maximal tolerable core temperature, which for my participant, and I've had quite a few through, it's always the same. I don't know if it changes over time, that you get more heat redundant over time, but for my participant, it's always, if you have if you stop at 40 degrees Celsius in your deep core rectal core temperature, then it's within very 0.01 or something like that, or 0.1 degree you stop every time. That is at least what I can draw out of my studies. And when you reach that point, then there is no protective effect. But it takes longer to reach that point, and that's the positive side of this. We just wanted to clamp it to see, are there any beneficial effects when you reach this high hypothermia level? Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I just want to clarify that they were doing the tests at the same rectal temperature, even though they, like you said, they've taken longer to get there as a result of adaptation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Fantastic. T?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Jacob, for a really nice presentation, and obviously a great set of studies for the PhD. So I have just two short questions, and if I understood correctly, if you sum it up, all the results, you mentioned that the complex cognitive or motor tasks are more affected by heat than basic ones. Do you think that's surprising, or?
No. It's not surprising, but as I think one of the main things that has been in the literature prior to this series of studies is that most do one-off studies where they choose a single type of testing, and it often is like kind of choice reaction related, which maybe doesn't make that much sense because of the Q10 effect. And then they simply take cognitive performance tests that might be developed for something different than actually heat, and that could be the CANTAB models, for instance, the Cambridge models, which is developed for a whole nother purpose, and definitely not the heat stuff. And then I think one of the beneficial things about this particular motor cognitive test is that it alternates between tasks, and you don't complete a full task and then move onto another. It's alternating, and therefore mimicking a more real world scenario than because when I sit here and do a presentation, somebody comes in, I need to take the lights go off, and I need to type on and the computer doesn't work. So I do multiple things at once, and that was what we wanted to mimic. Even though you may be a grapefruit picker, you still do. That's our experience, at least from some of Leonida's works, or a bus driver or something. You get multiple inputs and multiple outputs all the time, and not just rely on a single press on a button like this all the time. And that's why we develop it like this. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's great. Yeah. And the second one is also a bit methodological. I was quite fascinated by what you presented, the familiarization, and how many times, people needed to repeat it to make sure. But 500 repetitions obviously is a lot. So, and we always familiarize also in different settings, participants, and we don't do it, that many times. But was there a plateau, or was there a threshold where you said, okay, this is fine, because you showed us data from the beginning and then 500? Was it going down, improving all the time, or could you finish off the familiarization earlier?
Yeah, that's definitely kind of a plateau. I think if you are in a time rush, you can stop before the 500 trials, but we also, you can see it starts to plateau after 300 maybe.
Okay.
Start plateauing. It's more evident with the coefficient of variance, and this is not all participants I've had through. This is I think it's 20 different participants put it into this, but we did it with everybody, 500 trials, and doing piloting, I have had subjects who have done way more, I think, including myself, just to to make sure that we were on the right track. Why we did so many was just to be on the safe side, I think, rather than being on falling short and not being able to see something due to familiarization, and also because this protocol or the complex motor task was actually something I worked with prior to starting my PhD, and I knew it was extremely difficult to be really good at, and therefore we implemented in this, and nobody has implemented like cognitive tests like that before, and I thought if it's so difficult to be good at it, it might also show something within when you heat up. I think you can go with less, especially with the simpler tasks, but you also risk with the simpler tasks that you don't see anything, and then you have a then you at least can say that this task is not useful here. This battery of tasks is definitely useful, and we could definitely also improve upon it. I have a lot of great ideas to improve on the cognitive side here. If we should move on with further studies, which I definitely endorse people or other students to do, especially regarding to the solar radiation and measuring of more cortical temperatures of the brain would be really interesting to see.
Okay, thanks, and obviously keep up the good work. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Last one quickly for me, Jacob, just on that point. I might have missed it, so sorry. Over what period of time did you do the familiarization? Because obviously you've got to try and find that balance between not cognitively fatiguing people, which will affect their performance, or getting bored or that sort of stuff. Logistically, how did you do such a prolonged familiarization?
So we did it over 2 days. So we did 250 trials one day, so separate, because we also know from literatures within the cognitive field, like itself, like learning and stuff like that, you also have a day-to-day variance, but we also learn from one day to another day. So you keep some of that retention or you have some retention, right? So we separate by 2 days, because just sitting and tracking for 2 hours constantly, it's kind of boring. You can actually persist that score you have reached by the end. You can actually persist or keep that for many hours, and that's also, so fatigue is one thing. You actually don't get that fatigue, but of course it's really boring. So we separated those two by a day. They came in, and then they were a week. They were separated by a week, and then they came in again. And we actually, prior to all starts, we familiarized them for 15 minutes, or what we a more 100 more than the 500, just to be sure that they were ready for the day, and then we started. So it's a kind of warm up to the session. So we didn't take any risks. So it has been long, and it's taken a long time to do all this, similar to Josh, right? So, and heat is, as you all know, is not that nice to work in. So you need to have some good participants that want to come back. Yeah.
No, excellent. Yeah, I mean, you said lots and lots of hours, but to do it right, it takes lots and lots of hours.
Yeah, I think it's some of the most important in this area of the literature is that you need to be, even with the simplest task, you need to be, like we see here in the new department I am in, motor control and neuroscience, that even the simplest task, there's retention, and elderly or people above 30 loses some of the retention overnight, and so it's pretty varying, even with the simplest choice reaction time. So I think it's some of the most important is to familiarize subjects and some of what's lacked from the literature in the previous era. Yeah.
I absolutely 100% agree. Thank you again, both of you, Jacob and Josh, for covering a lot of information very well, very concisely, very neatly, very clearly. Huge battery of work from yourselves and obviously co-authors and the like. Thank you for everyone for joining us. We're going to try and run these every other week, but with a break now. So this is the second one, but we'll start off again in the new year, after a Christmas break. So I hope everybody stays healthy, stays well, enjoys some time away from work in the office over Christmas. And as and when we've got some sessions lined up for 2022, we'll advertise those in the usual way. So thanks again, Jacob and Josh. Excellent talk, and I wish you all a very merry festive season. I think that's the first time I've said that. So have an early Merry Christmas.
Thank you.